He stood at the service counter of Meridian Bank on Chestnut Street, with a number in his hand and grease still under his fingernails that he had not been able to scrub out completely before leaving the shop. Darnell Crews, 54 years old, wore a gray work shirt with his name stitched above the left pocket, the kind of shirt that tells you exactly what a man does before he opens his mouth. His boots had dried concrete on the left toe from a job 3 days ago. His hands were wide and calloused and had been that way since he was 19. He was holding a manila folder with a rubber band around it, the kind people use when the papers inside matter too much to let them slide around. He had taken the afternoon off work to be here. That was 2 hours of pay he would not see on Friday. He did not sit down. He stood near the edge of the waiting area and read the number on his paper and watched the screen above the teller windows. The folder was for his daughter's student loan cosign application. He had been gathering the documents for 6 weeks. Pay stubs going back 2 years, tax returns, a letter from his employer confirming permanent status, a copy of the property deed on the house in Kensington he had owned outright since 2019 after making the last payment on a 30-year mortgage his ex-wife had walked away from, and he had stayed and finished alone. And his daughter Keandra was 18. She had gotten into Drexel University on a partial scholarship. The rest needed a cosigner with enough credit history and enough on paper to make the bank feel secure. Darnell had both. He knew he had both because he had spent 20 years making sure he did. The woman who arrived after him did not take a number. She walked straight to the desk at the front, the one where a young man named Brandon sat beneath a placard that read Customer Relations. She was wearing a cream blazer over dark trousers and shoes that made a particular sound on the marble floor, a sound that carried. The leather bag on her arm was the color of cognac and had a clasp that caught the overhead light every time she moved. She did not wait. She said something to Brandon in a low voice, and Brandon stood up and walked quickly toward the back office. Darnell watched this and looked back at his number. He looked at the screen. Then he sat down in one of the chairs near the window because his back had been bothering him since Tuesday. The woman did not sit. She stood near the center of the floor with her phone out and read something on it, and then looked up and around the room the way a person looks when they consider themselves the most important thing in it. Brandon came back with a woman in a navy blazer behind him. Her name tag said Renata Osei, branch manager. She shook the woman's hand and said, "Mrs. Halford, right this way." Sandra Halford was 48 years old. She was the wife of Garrison Halford, who had made his money in commercial real estate and had put his name on 2 parking structures and a mixed-use development in Center City. She had her own money as well, inherited from her father, a man who had built a chain of dry cleaning businesses in the suburbs and sold them at the right moment. She wore that money the way certain people wear it. Not loudly, quietly and completely, the way a room is painted a color that does not call attention to itself but makes everything else in it look slightly less polished by comparison. She glanced at the waiting area as she passed. Her eyes moved across the chairs the way eyes move across furniture, not looking at the people in them, looking at the room. They moved past Darnell's chair. Sandra's gaze went to his work shirt, to his boots, to the rubber-banded folder on his knee. She did not stop, but she said something to Renata in a voice she did not lower. She said, "Does this branch not have a separate area for that kind of customer? I've always found it more comfortable when the waiting is divided." She said it the way a person makes a preference known, not cruelty exactly. Something more practiced than cruelty, the particular tone of someone who has been able to say whatever she thought for so long that she no longer registered the weight of her words on the people around her. Renata said something quiet. Darnell did not catch it. The 2 women continued toward the office. The man sitting 1 chair down from Darnell, 50s, reading a magazine, had heard it. He looked at the magazine. The young woman behind the teller window to the left had heard it. She looked at her screen. Darnell looked at his number. He had been looked at like that before. He had been spoken about in that voice before. In hardware stores and permit offices and the waiting rooms of city contractors who looked at his paperwork and then at him and sometimes took a moment longer than necessary to decide which version of the answer they were going to give him. He had learned the economy of those moments a long time ago. You could spend energy on them, or you could spend energy on the thing you came to do. He had always chosen the thing he came to do. His number was called 11 minutes later. He walked to window 4. The teller was young, early 20s, her hair pulled back. She had a small potted succulent on the right side of her desk and a photograph tucked into the corner of her monitor that he could not see fully from Mr. Smood. He laid the folder on the counter and opened it and began to place documents in order. He said, "I'm here to cosign a student loan for my daughter. Application number is on the first page. I've got 2 years of returns, current pay stubs, and the deed on my property." The teller, whose name tag read Opal, looked at the first page and typed something into her computer. She said, "Give me just a moment," he said. "Take your time." He stood with his hands flat on the counter. Not impatient, not performing patience, which is a different thing. Just still. The way a man is still when he has been waiting his whole life for things to move at their own pace and has made a kind of peace with that. He had learned stillness from his father, who had driven a city bus in Philadelphia for 31 years and who said, on the rare occasions he said anything about work, that the job was not about driving. The job was about where you stopped and whether you stopped all the way. His father had died in 2009. Darnell had taken 2 days off work for the funeral and gone back on the 3rd day, because there was no one else to finish what was scheduled. Opal was looking at her screen with a slight frown. She said, "I'm showing your file was flagged earlier this year for a late payment on your home equity line." Darnell said, "February. I was in the hospital in January. Gallbladder. I got out and the payment had been missed. I called and they corrected the notation. There should be a note on the file." Opal looked. She scrolled. She said, "I'm not seeing the note." He said, "I have the correspondence here." He reached into the back of the folder and produced a printed email chain, 3 pages. He slid it across the counter. She read it. She picked up her phone. While Opal was on hold with the correction department, the door to Renata's office opened. Sandra Alfard walked out. She was not done with her meeting. She had stepped out, apparently, for something. She walked to the water station along the side wall and filled a small paper cup. She looked toward window 4. She looked at Darnell's back, at the spread of documents on the counter, at Opal still on hold. She walked back toward the office and said to no one in particular, and everyone in range, "I hope they're not making everyone wait because one person can't get their paperwork together. Some of us have actual appointments." She said it without slowing down. She said it looking at her phone. The way a person adds a comment to a room, the way you add a footnote to a document. A thing that is technically separate, but that changes how you read everything around it. Opal's hand stopped on her pen. The man with the magazine 2 chairs over had heard it. The person at window 3 had heard it. A man standing near the door, waiting to be seen, somewhere in his 60s, sport coat and quiet shoes, had heard it. He had been standing near the door for 8 minutes. He had not taken a number. He was not waiting for the teller window. He was waiting for Renata to be done so he could drop something off and be on his way. His name was Hugh Calloway. Hugh was 61 years old. He was wearing a charcoal blazer and dark slacks and a pale blue shirt with no tie. He had a leather messenger bag over one shoulder, worn on the strap in the way that comes from years of use and not from anything bought to look worn. He was unremarkable in the way that certain men are unremarkable. No logos. No visible signal of anything beyond a man who wears clothing that fits and does not need anyone in the room to know the price of it. He had a pen in his hand because he had been reviewing a document when Sandra Halford said what she said. He put the pen in his pocket. He did not move toward the window. He did not say anything yet. He looked at the back of Darnell's head, at the stack of documents on the counter, At Opal still waiting on hold with the phone against her ear, and her eyes moving from the screen to the man in front of her and back to the screen, as though she was trying to calculate something she was not sure she was allowed to calculate. He looked at the office door. He looked at Sandra Halford's back as she pushed the door open and walked back inside. Something happened in Hugh Calloway's face. It did not show in the obvious way. It was the kind of shift that happens in a person when they have made a decision and the decision has weight. He walked to window 4. He stood slightly behind Darnell, not crowding, not announcing, just present. When Opal came off hold and said, "Sir, they've confirmed the notation was added. They're going to send a refresh to our system. It may take 10 to 15 minutes. Hugh said, from where he stood, "Is there a supervisor who can confirm it so this gentleman doesn't have to wait?" Opal looked at him. "Sir, I'm helping another customer right now." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking if there's someone else who can move this along." Darnell turned to look at the man behind him. He saw the blazer, the messenger bag, the expression that was not aggressive and not performing. "Just clear," Darnell said. "You don't have to do that." Hugh said, "I know." He said it the way a person says something that is true and does not need to be argued. Renata's office door opened again. This time it stayed open. Renata came out alone. She walked toward the front desk and Hugh raised a hand slightly. She saw it and changed direction. He said to her, "There's a notation correction that needs to be confirmed so this gentleman's file can be processed. It was apparently submitted in February and should be in the system but isn't displaying correctly." Renata looked at Opal. Opal nodded. Renata said, "Let me pull it up directly." She typed for 45 seconds. She said, "There it is. It flagged as depending because the original ticket was never closed. I can close it now." She looked at Darnell. "I apologize for the inconvenience. This should have been resolved months ago." Darnell said, "Thank you." It was not a large word. He did not add anything to it. He turned back to the counter and straightened his documents. Renata walked back toward her office and then stopped. She stopped because Sandra Halford was in the doorway. Sandra had seen the exchange. She was holding her paper cup. Her expression had changed in the way that expressions change when the room has rearranged itself without asking permission. She looked at Hugh. She took in the blazer, the messenger bag, the worn strap. She said, "I didn't realize you were waiting. Why didn't you say something to me? I could have had Renata come out right away." She said it with warmth. The kind of warmth that is calibrated, that arrives at a particular wattage depending on who is in the room. She said it as though she and Hugh were acquaintances, as though the natural order of things was that people like them knew each other. Hugh looked at her. He said, "I wasn't waiting on anything urgent." She laughed lightly. "Well, I know Garrison has mentioned your firm in connection with the Locust Street project. I'll have to tell him you were so patient." Hugh said, "I don't think patience is the right word." She looked at him. The warmth adjusted, slightly. The way a thermostat adjusts when the temperature in the room changes by 2 degrees. He said, "I heard what you said when you came out, about one person's paperwork holding things up, and before that, when you walked in, about dividing the waiting area." Sandra's expression held. He said, "This man has been standing at that counter for 20 minutes with 2 years of documents in order trying to cosign his daughter's college loan. He had a notation error on his file that should have been fixed in February and wasn't." He paused. There was nothing wrong with his paperwork. Sandra opened her mouth. Hugh said, "I'm not saying this because of Garrison or the Locust Street project. I'm saying it because you said it in front of a room full of people and nobody said anything, and that seemed like the wrong way to leave it." He did not raise his voice. He did not close the distance between them. He stood where he was and spoke with the kind of even clarity that does not need volume to land. The man with the magazine 2 chairs over had stopped reading. Opal's pen was still on the counter. The person at window 3 was looking at a spot on the wall that had nothing on it. Sandra said, "I was simply making an observation about efficiency. I have an appointment and the branch should be able to manage its customers without." Hugh said, His name is on the board above the window just like yours is. Silence. The refrigerated air of the bank hummed. A phone rang somewhere in the back and was picked up quickly. Sandra looked at Renata. Renata was looking at her hands. Darnell had not turned around. He was watching Opal complete the file on her screen. His hands were flat on the counter. Whatever was happening behind him, he had already decided what it meant and what he was going to do with it, which was finish what he came to do. Kiandra needed that cosign. That was what he had driven here for. That was what the afternoon off was for, and the folder, and the 6 weeks of gathering, and the email chain he had printed and put in the back of the file. The rest of it he would process later, the same way he processed most of what happened to him in rooms like this. Quietly, on his own time, without giving it more space than it deserved. Opal said, "Mr. Crews, I'm showing everything confirmed. I can proceed with the application." He said, "Let's do it." Hugh Calloway left the bank 12 minutes later. He had dropped off the document he came to drop off and declined Renata's offer to wait in the conference room. He walked out through the glass doors into the afternoon on Chestnut Street and stood for a moment on the sidewalk. He had not planned to say anything. He had been standing there with a pen in his hand, reading a contract clause, and he had heard those words and something in him had simply moved. Not a decision, exactly. More like a reflex, the way a hand moves before the brain finishes the sentence. He had grown up in West Oak Lane. His mother, Eunice Calloway, had worked the register at a grocery on Germantown Avenue for 16 years. She had come home every evening with her feet in bad shape and her hair under a store visor she would take off at the door as though leaving something behind on the threshold. She was the most competent person he had ever known. She could calculate a customer's change before the drawer opened. She could de-escalate a line of 12 impatient people with a tone of voice. She ran that register the way a conductor runs an orchestra. Without a single instrument being given more attention than it needed or less than it deserved, people had spoken to her the way Sandra Halford had spoken in that bank, not always out loud, sometimes with their eyes, sometimes with the way they counted their money before handing it to her, making sure, as though the question of whether she could be trusted was a thing that needed resolving every single time. She never said a word about it. She checked out their groceries. She gave them their change. She said have a good afternoon the way she meant it, which was genuinely, because she was that kind of person, regardless of what kind of person was standing on the other side of the counter. He had learned everything he wanted to be from watching everything she was. Hugh Calloway was a civil rights attorney. He had spent 32 years working on housing discrimination cases in Philadelphia. His firm had 4 lawyers and a paralegal named Gwen, who had been with them since the beginning, and who ran the office the way his mother had run that register. His name was on 2 precedent-setting cases from the late 90s that were still cited in coursework at Penn Law. He had never told anyone in that bank any of that. He had no intention of doing so. He had not stood at window 4 because of his credentials. He had stood there because of what he saw. A man with his paperwork in order being made to wait for a mistake that was not his, while a woman whose only credential was the bag on her arm made him feel like the inconvenience in a room where he had every right to be. He had said what he said. The sidewalk was loud with afternoon traffic. He turned and started walking toward his office on Walnut Street. He had gone half a block when he heard someone say his name. He turned. The man in the gray work shirt was standing on the sidewalk 3 steps behind him. The folder was under his arm. He had clearly just come out of the bank. Darnell Crews said, "I heard what you said in there." Hugh said, "I know. You didn't have to do that. You said that already." Darnell looked at him. He was not smiling. He was looking at Hugh the way a man looks at something he is still deciding what to make of. Not with suspicion. With the particular care of a person who has learned that favors and gestures and interventions on your behalf sometimes come with shapes you did not agree to. He said, "Were you going to tell her who you are?" Hugh said. She thought she already knew. That landed. Darnell nodded once. Slow. the nod of someone who understood completely and did not need it elaborated on. He said, "She mentioned a Locust Street project." Hugh said, "My firm is involved in a case connected to that development. I would rather not discuss it." He paused. "I will say that what she did in that bank today is the same thing certain developers do on paper. They just use different vocabulary." Darnell looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter got into Drexel." Something shifted in Hugh's face. The professional distance came down a fraction. Just a fraction. Enough. He said, "Engineering?" Darnell said, "Pre-med." Hugh was quiet. He said, "What's her name?" "Keandra." He said the name the way a father says a daughter's name when he is proud and does not know how else to show it, and so says the name as though the name itself carries the whole thing. Hugh said, "My mother wanted me to be a doctor." Darnell said, "What happened?" "I was better at arguing." He almost smiled. "She forgave me." They stood on the sidewalk for another moment. The afternoon moved around them, buses and foot traffic, and a delivery truck idling at the corner. Hugh reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a business card. He held it out. Darnell took it. He read it. His expression did not change outwardly, but something behind it registered. Hugh Cathaway. Cathaway. Murtaugh and Associates. Civil rights law, Hugh said. "If Keandra ever wants to talk to someone about public interest law, or if she runs into something at Drexel that doesn't sit right." He paused. "My firm does pro bono work with first-generation students. We have 2 right now." Darnell looked at the card. He said, "She wants to be a surgeon." Hugh said, "Even better. She'll need to know how to fight for her patients one day. Might as well know how to fight for herself first." Darnell put the card in the front pocket of his work shirt, not the folder, the shirt pocket. The one near where his name was stitched. He said, "I appreciate it. Not thank you for what you did in the bank. Not a reference to Sandra Halford's, or the things she said, or the way Opal had looked, or the 12 minutes it had taken to close a notation that should have been closed in February. Just, I appreciate it. The quiet, whole sentence of a man who does not give gratitude easily and means every word of it when he does." Hugh said, "I hope she gets in everywhere she applies." He turned and walked toward Walnut Street. Darnell stood on the sidewalk for another moment. Then he walked the other direction toward where he had parked, 3 blocks down, in a lot that charged by the hour. The loan was approved 6 business days later. Keandra's enrollment was confirmed the following week. She called her father from the school's financial aid office, and he could hear her trying not to cry and not succeeding. He was in the truck when she called. He pulled over. She said, "Dad, it went through." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to Drexel." He said, "I know." She said, "Dad," he said, "I know, baby." He sat in the truck on a side street in Germantown for a while after the call ended. The radio was off. There was traffic noise and the sound of a school letting out a block over. He had been working since he was 15 years old. Dishwasher first, then a stock boy, then a summer with a cousin who did concrete work, and he had never left the concrete. He had learned every part of it: foundation pours, flat work, decorative finishes, repair, restoration. He had started his own crew in 2003 with 2 guys and a truck and a list of contacts he had built over 10 years of showing up on time and leaving the site cleaner than he found it. He had 14 employees now, 16 when the commercial jobs ran heavy. He owned the truck and 2 others, and a piece of equipment that had taken him 4 years to pay off, and which he intended to keep running until it stopped. He had raised Keandra alone since she was 9. Her mother had left and come back and left again, and he had stopped counting the cycles somewhere around the 3rd time and focused on the child who was there every morning and needed breakfast and clean clothes and someone to look at her like she was the most important thing in the room. He had been doing that for 9 years. When she was 12, she told him she wanted to be a doctor because her grandmother had been sick when Keandra was small, and nobody in the hospital had looked at her like she was important. And Keandra had decided she was going to be the kind of doctor who looked at people that way. He had said, "You're going to need to study." She had said, "I know, Dad, I already study." He had said, "More than that. She had said, "I know." She had known. She had studied more than that. She had studied as though the future she wanted was a thing she had to build herself from whatever material she had available, which was exactly what it was, and which was exactly what she did. Drexel was the second best offer she received. The first had deferred her a year. She chose Drexel because they didn't. Darnell did not tell her about what happened at the bank. He would not tell her. The folder and the documents and the 6 weeks of gathering and the afternoon off and the hour parking lot and Sandra Halford and the notation that should have been closed in February were not things Keandra needed to carry. They were his to carry. He had been carrying things like that his whole life so that she wouldn't have to. He started the truck and pulled back into traffic. In the weeks that followed, something else happened. Not all at once, not with ceremony. Renata filed an internal report about the service failure on Darnell's account. She had been at the bank for 4 years, and the notation error had happened under her branch, and she was not the kind of manager who let that go unremarked. The report triggered a review of other pending notation corrections across the branch. There were 9 of them. 9 accounts where customers had submitted correction requests through proper channels, and the tickets had been marked pending and never resolved. 2 of them had resulted in loan denials that were now under secondary review. Renata sent a letter to each of those account holders. She signed it herself. Sandra Halford finished her meeting that day and drove back to Chestnut Hill, and did not think about the bank until later that week when Garrison mentioned, at dinner, that Hugh Calloway's firm had filed a pre-suit notice against the Locust Street development. She said, "Hugh Calloway." Garrison looked at her. She said, "I think I ran into him at the bank." Garrison set down his fork. She did not tell him what she had said in the waiting area. She did not tell him about the man at window 4, or the work shirt, or the folder, or what Hugh had said to her. She told herself she did not mention it because it was not relevant, but there was another reason. One she did not look at directly, but that sat in the room with her that evening the way certain things sit in a room. Quiet, unmoving, not leaving. She had not thought of herself as someone who said those kinds of things. She thought of herself as direct, as practical, as someone with high standards for how her time was spent. She had not thought of the man at the counter. She had thought of the line and her appointment and the general category of inconvenience. She had not thought of him as someone with a folder full of careful documents and a daughter who was going to be a doctor and an afternoon of wages he could not get back. She did not apologize. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some people reach that and some people do not. But the quiet thing in the room that evening was a beginning of something. Even if she would never call it that. Even if she would never tell anyone it had happened. Hugh Calloway's mother, Eunice, was 77 years old and lived in a row house in West Oak Lane that Hugh had bought for her 12 years ago after the first big settlement came through. She did not use the word settlement. She called it when Hugh got that case right. She grew tomatoes in the front window. She still made her own bread on Sundays. He called her every Thursday. He told her about the bank. She said, "You said something." He said, "I did." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I always told you the ones who look away feel it too. They just feel it in a different place." He said, "The man's daughter got into Drexel." Eunice said, "What's she studying?" He said, "Pre-med." His mother made a sound. Short. The sound of someone who receives good news the way a plant receives rain. Directly, without comment, through every part of itself. She said, "You tell him I said congratulations." He said, "I don't have his number." She said, "Then find it. You're a lawyer." He smiled. He said he would. He did not find it that week or the next. But 3 months later, he was in a coffee shop on Germantown Avenue when a man in a gray work shirt came through the door, and the shirt had a name stitched above the left pocket. And Hugh looked at it and said the name out loud, and Darnell Crews turned around from the counter and looked at him. They stood there for a moment. Hugh said, "My mother wants to congratulate your daughter." Darnell said, "Your mother?" Hugh said, "She says good news like that deserves to be said properly." They got coffee. They sat at a small table near the window. They talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with banks or lawyers or developers or notation errors. Darnell talked about concrete and the crew and the commercial job in Fishtown that had run 3 weeks long because of a subcontractor issue. Hugh talked about the Locust Street case and a housing discrimination brief he was finishing. They talked about their mothers. They talked about the city. When Darnell stood to leave, he said, "Keandra would probably like to talk to one of your pro bono students." Hugh said, "I'll set it up." Darnell put on his jacket. He stood for a moment and looked at Hugh, the way you look at something you are still calibrating. Not with uncertainty, with the attention you give something that turned out to matter more than you expected. He said, "You didn't have to say anything in that bank." Hugh said, I know you know." He paused. "I'm saying I'm glad you did." He walked out the door into the afternoon on Germantown Avenue, back toward the truck, back toward the crew, back toward the next job, and the next pour, and the next morning, that Keandra would wake up in a Drexel dorm room, on a path she had built herself, because her father had made sure the ground was solid enough for her to build it on. Some things cost you nothing to say. You already know the right words. You have known them since you were young, since you watched someone you loved be looked at the wrong way by someone who had confused their wallet for their worth. The only question was always whether you were going to say them or swallow them. The ones who swallow them usually tell themselves they didn't want to cause a scene. The ones who say them usually tell themselves they weren't going to, that it just came out. That is almost never true. It is always a choice. It is just that for some people, the choice has been made so many times, in so many rooms, watching so many things go unsaid, that when the moment comes, what looks like a reflex is actually the accumulated weight of every time they stayed quiet and decided, finally, that this time they weren't going to. You do not need a title for it to matter. You do not need a name tag or a firm or a precedent-setting case from 1998 that is still on a syllabus somewhere. You need to be in the room, and you need to decide what you're going to do with what you see. That is all. If this story reminded you of someone who spoke up when they didn't have to, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And leave a comment below. Tell us, when was the last time someone said something on your behalf when they didn't have to? What did it cost them? What did it give you?